I had been looking forward to the trip for months. It was supposed to be a week of solitude, just me and the woods, away from the noise of my life. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forests of Montana, miles from the nearest town, barely reachable by an old logging road. I wanted the isolation. No cell service, no distractions. Just time to clear my head, maybe do some hiking, some fishing, and let the quiet of the wild settle into my bones. The cabin was old but sturdy, a single-room structure with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a cot pushed up against the wall. There was an outhouse about 20 yards behind it and a fire pit in front. The guy I rented it from gave me a key but told me he usually didn't bother locking it. No one came out here anyway. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I spent the afternoon gathering wood, setting up my gear, and getting a feel for the land. The air was crisp, the trees thick with autumn leaves, and the only sounds were the rustling of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. That first night, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and watching the flames dance against the darkness. The sky was black, the stars bright, and there was a peace in the silence that felt rare and good. I went to bed early, the weight of the real world already slipping off my shoulders. I woke sometime in the night to a sound outside. It was soft, distant, but enough to pull me from sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was more deliberate, slow, measured footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed, but I heard nothing more. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal, a deer, maybe, or something smaller, nosing around in the dark. The next morning, I checked around the cabin but saw nothing unusual. I told myself I was overthinking it, let it go, and spent the day hiking. I followed an old trail that wound up into the hills, spent hours exploring, and didn't see another soul. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, and I was exhausted. That night, I made a fire again, cooked some food, and sat watching the flames until my eyelids grew heavy. The woods were quiet, the air cold, and I felt safe in the glow of the fire. But then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and careful, just beyond the firelight. I froze. The sound stopped the second I moved. I strained my eyes into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the flames. My pulse hammered in my ears. I forced myself to stand, my skin prickling, and grabbed my flashlight. I swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. I called out, but the night swallowed my voice. I told myself it was an animal, forced myself inside, locked the door, and sat on the cot with my hunting knife in my hand. I barely slept. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt near the treeline. Not boot prints, bare feet. My stomach dropped. The prints were fresh, leading from the woods to the edge of the fire pit and then back again. Someone had been watching me. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I had driven hours to get here, had spent months planning this trip. Maybe it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe they were gone now. Still, I kept my rifle close that night. I didn't make a fire, didn't want to give away my position. I sat in the dark, listening. And then, in the early hours, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Not mine. Not an animal. Just outside the cabin, low and steady, like someone standing right against the wall. I gripped the rifle, my hands slick with sweat. The breathing didn't stop. It stayed there for what felt like hours, slow and calm, like whoever it was knew I was listening, knew I was too afraid to move. At some point, it faded away, but I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first light of morning crept through the cracks in the walls, I went outside, rifle raised, ready for anything. But there was nothing, just the trees, the cold morning air, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided then I was leaving. I packed my gear as fast as I could, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started towards my truck. That's when I saw it. Near the edge of the trees, where the footprints had been the day before, something hung from a low branch. A rabbit, skinned, its body limp, blood dripping onto the dirt below. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here while I slept. Someone had left that there. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the truck, started the engine, and tore down that old logging road like the devil was on my heels. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station, hands shaking, breath coming in sharp bursts. The guy behind the counter gave me a look as I walked in. "You all right?" he asked. I almost told him. I almost explained everything, the footsteps, the breathing, the rabbit hanging from the tree. But I didn't. What could I say? That I had been scared out of the woods by nothing I could prove? I just nodded, bought a coffee, and sat in my truck until my hands stopped shaking. I never went back to that cabin. Never even tried. I don't know who was out there watching me, waiting. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, steady breathing just beyond the walls. I had planned the trip months in advance. I needed time away, a real break from everything. Work, people, the city. Just silence, solitude, and the woods. I found a cabin deep in the forests of northern Idaho. A place far enough off the grid that there'd be no cell service. No roads beyond a narrow dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived in the early afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected. The last stretch of road nothing but a winding path of mud and rocks cutting through dense trees. The cabin was small but solid, sitting in a clearing with thick woods on all sides. It had a single room, a wood stove, and a narrow cot pushed against the wall. No electricity, just an old lantern on the table and a pile of firewood stacked near the door. The guy who owned the place had warned me it was rustic. That was fine. I wasn't here for comfort. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, gathered more wood, and walked the perimeter of the clearing, just getting a feel for the place. The forest was dense, the kind that pressed in around you, swallowing sound. No trails, no signs of other people. Just towering pines, fallen logs, and the thick, damp scent of earth. I spent the evening by the fire pit out front, watching the sky darken, listening to the crackle of burning wood. The night was silent, no distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural at first, like the world had been put on mute. I went inside when the cold set in, locked the door, and crawled into the cot. I expected to sleep deeply, but I woke up hours later, heart pounding. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin was pitch black, the air still. Then I heard it, a sound outside, soft, deliberate, the crunch of footsteps moving through the clearing. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow, steady, moving in a circle around the cabin. Not an animal, too heavy, too controlled. Someone was out there. I lay frozen, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. Just the wind outside, the creak of the old wood stove as it cooled. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed still, ears alert, waiting. But whoever or whatever had been out there didn't come back. By morning, it almost felt like I'd imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. Bare feet. I felt my stomach drop. The prints circled the cabin, stopping just outside the door before leading back toward the trees. I followed them a few steps, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. No sign of who had made them. I told myself it was probably a drifter, some lost camper. Maybe they'd stumbled across the cabin and left when they saw it was occupied. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. I spent the day walking the woods, looking for any sign that someone else was out there. A campsite, more tracks, anything. But there was nothing, just trees stretching in every direction. That night, I kept the lantern burning, my rifle close. I tried to read, tried to push the thought of those footprints out of my mind. But as the hours passed, unease settled over me like a weight. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. I gripped my rifle, pulse pounding. The steps moved to the window, pausing just beyond the thin curtain. I felt the hair on my arms rise. Whoever it was, they were standing there, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The moment stretched on, unbearable. Then, just as slowly, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I went outside, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. The clearing was empty, but when I looked down, my stomach twisted. More footprints. Closer this time, right up to the window. I needed to leave. I packed my things in minutes, shoving everything into my truck, throwing dirt over the fire pit. I didn't care about the refund. I just wanted out. But when I got in the truck and turned the key, nothing happened. Dead. I checked the battery, the connections. Everything looked fine. It had been running perfectly the day before. I tried again. Nothing. Just the click of a dead engine. Panic set in. I was miles from town, no cell service, no way to call for help. I could hike out, but that meant walking hours through the woods alone, knowing someone was out there. I decided to wait until morning, hoping I could figure out what was wrong with the truck in daylight. I locked the doors, gripped my rifle, and waited. Then, deep into the night, I heard it. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Close. Right outside the truck. Slow, steady, deliberate. I stayed absolutely still, my fingers tightening around the rifle. The breathing continued, just beyond the glass. Then, a soft drag of fingers along the window. Not a knock. Not an attempt to get in. Just a slow, deliberate touch, trailing along the glass. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I waited hours before I dared to move. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I forced myself to step outside. The ground around the truck was covered in footprints, bare feet circling over and over, and on the hood of my truck, something had been placed. My car battery. I left it. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran. I ran down that dirt road, rifle clutched in my hands, lungs burning. I ran until I reached the highway, where a passing truck driver found me, shaking and gasping for breath. I never went back, never told anyone the full story, just left the truck, the cabin, everything. But sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and swear I can hear it. That slow, steady breathing just beyond the wall. I had been camping since I was a teenager. It was never anything extreme, just a way to escape for a few days, to be somewhere quiet. I wasn't a survivalist or anything like that, just someone who liked the woods. This trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just 3 nights out in the forest, alone. I had done it plenty of times before. There was a stretch of land about 100 miles from where I lived, mostly untouched, deep enough that I wouldn't see another person the entire time. It wasn't an official campsite, just public land that didn't see much foot traffic. The last time I had been out there was almost a year ago, and I remembered thinking how peaceful it was. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a small hatchet, my knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and my rifle. I didn't always bring a gun on camping trips, but this area was remote. I had never seen a bear out here, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard. The drive took most of the afternoon. I followed the highway until it turned into a smaller road, then finally a dirt path that wound through the trees. My truck handled it fine, but I could feel every bump, every dip in the road. Eventually, I reached a spot where I had parked before, just a small clearing off the path. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees. I grabbed my pack and locked up the truck. The hike in was only a couple of miles, but the terrain was rough in places. No real trails, just old deer paths cutting through the undergrowth. I had my GPS, though, and I wasn't worried about getting lost. Took about an hour to reach the spot. A small clearing, maybe 20 yards across, bordered by thick trees. A shallow creek ran nearby, which meant I wouldn't have to use much of my bottled water. I had camped here before, and it looked the same as I remembered. Undisturbed. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to have some cover but far enough that nothing would fall on me if a storm rolled in. After gathering firewood, I started a small fire and cooked some food. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, but the fire helped. As the sun dipped lower, I sat by the fire and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was mostly quiet, an occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds. I didn't feel uneasy, not yet, but something was different. Took me a while to put my finger on it, but then I realized. The woods were too quiet. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that even at night, the forest is never completely silent. There are always insects, small animals moving in the brush. But now there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the wind through the trees. I told myself it was fine. Maybe the temperature had dropped just enough to keep the bugs away. Maybe the wind had shifted, making it harder to hear the usual night sounds. Still, I kept my rifle close as I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. At some point in the night, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and outside, everything was still. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps. Not an animal. Something heavier. They stopped just outside my tent. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe more than that. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal. No broken branches, no footprints. I started to wonder if I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Still, I felt uneasy. I spent most of the day trying to shake the feeling. I gathered more wood, checked the area for any signs that someone had been nearby. But there was nothing. By evening, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Just paranoia. Then, as I was sitting by the fire, sharpening my knife, I noticed something. The trees just beyond the clearing, something was there. Not moving, just standing. Couldn't make out details. It was too far, and the light was fading. But there was a shape. Human. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, staring into the trees. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward. The shape shifted, almost like it was stepping back into the darkness. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, my rifle across my lap. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just the wind, but I knew better. At some point, just before dawn, I heard something behind my tent. A deep, slow breathing. Not mine. I turned, gripping my rifle, but by the time I crawled out of the tent, there was nothing there. That was enough. As soon as it was light, I packed up my gear. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother cleaning up the campsite. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking. The whole way back, I felt it, that presence, that sense of being watched. I moved fast, my heart pounding with every step. The trees felt closer than before, the air heavier. Then, just as I reached my truck, I saw something. Footprints, leading from the tree line, barefoot, large. They stopped a few feet from my truck. Whoever, whatever, had been watching me had come close. Too close. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest. I had planned this hike for months. It was a remote trail in the mountains, deep in the woods, the kind of place where you could walk for days without seeing another person. That was the appeal. I wanted solitude, a break from the noise of life, the endless stream of emails and phone calls, the constant pull of obligations. I had done plenty of hikes before, but nothing this isolated. I parked my truck at the small dirt lot where the trailhead started. There were no other cars. That was a good sign. It meant I'd have the place to myself. I slung my heavy pack over my shoulders, adjusted the straps, and stepped onto the narrow path leading into the woods. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well-defined, the air was crisp, and the silence was almost overwhelming. No traffic sounds, no distant hum of civilization. Just the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt. Felt good. I felt strong, like I could walk forever. As the day went on, the trail became rougher. Roots snaked across the path. Rocks jutted out in odd places. I had to watch my step. I checked my map frequently, making sure I was on course. There were no markers, no signs, just the thin dirt path winding through miles of dense forest. I liked that. Felt like I was truly out there, away from everything. I hiked all day, stopping only for short breaks. By late afternoon, my legs were sore, and I was drenched in sweat. I found a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp. I unrolled my tent, set up my little stove, and boiled water for a dehydrated meal. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows. The air cooled fast. After eating, I sat by the stream, listening to the water. There was something about the sound. It was peaceful, but at the same time, it made me uneasy. Maybe because it was the only sound. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. I told myself I was just overthinking. I was alone after all. Nothing to be scared of. I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in. Took a while to fall asleep, but eventually, exhaustion won. I woke up to a sound. A sharp snap like a branch breaking. My eyes opened wide. I held my breath. Listened. Silence. Maybe it was an animal. A deer, a raccoon. The woods were full of them. I closed my eyes again. Then, another snap. Closer. I sat up, my heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The thin beam cut through the darkness. I aimed it at the trees. Nothing. Just the tangled mess of branches and shadows. I told myself it was nothing. Falling branch. A small animal. My mind was playing tricks on me. I lay back down, forced myself to breathe slow. Eventually, I drifted off. The next day, I packed up and kept moving. I had planned to hike deeper into the woods before looping back in a few days. The trail was even rougher now, steeper. I had to use my hands to steady myself on the incline. The trees were thicker, the path narrower. Felt different, more isolated. By midday, I noticed something strange. The forest was silent, not just quiet, silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant scurrying of animals. Felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept walking. Then I saw something on the trail ahead. A footprint. Not mine. It was fresh. The edges were crisp, a deep imprint in the dirt. It was a boot print. Someone else was out here. I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was a relief. I wasn't completely alone. But on the other hand, something about it made my stomach knot up. I hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead. No signs of campsites, no smoke from fires, just this footprint, deep in the dirt, heading in the same direction as me. I kept moving, but now I was hyper-aware of my surroundings. My ears strained for any sound. My eyes scanned every shadow. An hour later, I saw something else. A piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark-colored, maybe from a jacket. It wasn't old. It hadn't been there long. I started to feel like I was being watched. I moved faster. The trail wound up a steep hill, and when I reached the top, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. Down in the valley below, deep in the trees, there was a small clearing. And in that clearing, there was a tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't an ordinary campsite. From this distance, I could barely make it out, but something about it looked wrong. The tent was sagging, almost collapsed. There were dark shapes scattered around it. I pulled out my binoculars for a closer look. The tent was torn open. Gear was scattered around, and next to it, half hidden in the brush, was something that made my blood turn to ice. A backpack. It looked just like mine. Same brand, same color, same model. I felt sick. I had a choice. I could go down there, see if someone needed help, or I could turn around and get the hell out. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. I listened. I turned around and started walking back the way I came. Fast. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just moved. But as the hours passed, I realized something horrifying. The trail didn't look right. I checked my map again and again. I should have been getting close to where I camped the first night. But nothing looked familiar. Then I saw something ahead on the trail. A footprint, deep in the dirt. Not mine. And it was facing the opposite direction, like someone had been following me. Panic set in. I started running. My heavy pack slammed against my back. Branches whipped my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. Then up ahead, something moved, a shadow slipping between the trees. I didn't stop. I kept running. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw something through the trees. The parking lot. My truck. I sprinted to it, yanked open the door, threw my pack inside. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, sped out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, I kept looking in my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. I never found out who was out there, and I don't want to, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. There's a reason people tell you to stick to marked trails. I used to think that was just something they said to keep tourists from getting lost. I had spent years hiking alone, cutting through backcountry, bushwhacking through thick forests, scrambling over ridges where no clear trail existed. I was careful, experienced, and always prepared. I knew how to read a map, how to use a compass, how to find my way back if things went wrong. But none of that mattered in the end. This happened 2 years ago, and I still wake up some nights, sweating, hearing the sound of dry branches snapping behind me. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trip. A loop through a remote section of national forest, miles away from any towns or roads. I had found the route online, an old logging trail that connected to a high ridge with incredible views. Not many people hiked it anymore, which made it perfect for me. I liked being alone in the woods. It was the only place that ever felt right. I packed everything I needed: food, water, first aid kit, knife, GPS, map. The forecast was clear. No storms, no high winds. I started early, parking my truck at the trailhead before the sun was fully up. The first few miles were easy, winding through thick pines, the ground soft with fallen needles. The air was cool, crisp. Birds called out in the distance, the rhythmic sound of woodpeckers echoing through the trees. I felt good, strong. By noon, I had covered a lot of ground. The trail was overgrown in places, but still easy to follow. It climbed gradually, leading toward the ridge. I took my time, stopping to filter water from a clear, cold creek. I ate a quick meal, checked my map. Everything was going exactly as planned. But then, a few miles later, I saw something strange. A shoe, half buried in the dirt, just off the trail. It was old, torn, the laces missing. The kind of thing you'd expect to see in a thrift store bin, not lying in the middle of the woods. I frowned, nudging it with my boot. It didn't make sense. This wasn't a popular area. The last trip report I had read was over a year old. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I tried to ignore it, kept moving. An hour later, I found something worse. A backpack, faded, ripped open down one side, half hidden beneath a fallen branch. It had been there a long time. The fabric was stiff, stained with dirt. I crouched down, my stomach tightening. There was no ID inside. No wallet, no phone. Just a few rusted zippers, a torn piece of fabric where a logo used to be. I stood up quickly, wiping my hands on my pants. My pulse was pounding now. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter had abandoned it. Maybe a hiker had lost it years ago. But I didn't believe that. I kept moving faster now. My skin felt tight, like something was pressing in on me. The trees thinned as I climbed higher, the air growing cooler. The trail was barely visible now, more of an impression in the grass than a real path. But I had my compass, my map. I wasn't worried about getting lost. Then I saw the footprints. Fresh, not mine. They cut through the grass, leading up the ridge. Deep, clear. Not distorted by wind or rain. Someone had been here. Recently. My hands felt cold despite the sun. I looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the spaces between them. Nothing moved. But I knew. I wasn't alone. I kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just another hiker, someone I hadn't seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sun was getting lower now, dipping toward the horizon. I needed to find a place to set up camp. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The ridge was too steep to climb in the dark. I found a flat patch of ground near a cluster of boulders. It was sheltered from the wind, a good spot. I set up my tent quickly, my movements stiff, uneasy. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, listened to the forest around me. The wind whispered through the trees, dry branches shifting, creaking. But no birds, no insects, nothing. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I drifted off. Then a sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. I snapped awake, my body rigid. The footsteps were close, circling my tent. Not an animal, not the random rustling of the wind. Someone was out there. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. The steps stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes. Hours. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have slept, because when I opened my eyes again, the sky was pale gray, the first light of dawn stretching over the ridge. I sat up, my muscles stiff, my throat dry. Then I saw it, just outside my tent. A single footprint, closer than before. I packed my gear in minutes, shoving everything into my pack without caring how. I started moving, fast. The ridge was steep, the path narrow, winding between sharp rocks. My legs burned, my breath came hard, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out. I followed the trail down, moving as quickly as I could without slipping. Every few minutes I checked behind me. Nothing. But the feeling was still there. That pressure. That weight. Like eyes on my back. The trail flattened out near the base of the ridge, leading into a dense stand of trees. The last stretch before the road. I moved faster. Then movement. Up ahead. A shape. A figure. Standing half hidden in the trees, still as stone. I stopped. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then it moved. Not toward me. Not away. Just shifted slightly. Watching. I didn't think. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face. My boots slipping on loose dirt. I ran until my chest ached, until my vision blurred. I burst out of the trees onto the gravel road where my truck was parked. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I didn't look back. I started the engine, peeled out, the tires skidding on loose gravel. I drove for miles before I could breathe again. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. I still hike, but never alone, never off trail. Because some places aren't meant to be explored. And some things, once they find you, they don't let go. I never wanted to go back to that place. It had been years since I last saw the cabin, buried deep in the Tennessee woods. My grandfather built it when my dad was a kid, a hunting retreat for weekends and cold autumn mornings. I only went a few times growing up, but even as a kid, I didn't like it. It wasn't haunted, not cursed or anything like that. It was just off. The air always felt too still. The trees pressed too close. The silence stretched too long. When I was 16, I told my dad I never wanted to go again. He didn't argue. I think deep down he felt the same way. But now, years later, I was back. Not by choice. My dad passed suddenly. Heart attack. No warning, no goodbyes. I barely had time to process it before I was thrown into the mess of handling his things. He didn't own much, a house, a car, a few savings accounts. And the cabin. I could have sold it without going back. But I needed to see it first. Maybe out of some stupid sense of closure. Maybe just to make sure it was still standing. So I packed a bag, borrowed my uncle's truck, and made the drive. I left early, but the roads turned rough as I got deeper into the mountains. And by the time I reached the dirt trail leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. It looked the same as I remembered. Small, wooden, dark. The porch sagged slightly, the roof covered in dead leaves. The front door was locked, but the key was still hidden under the same loose board on the porch. I turned it in the rusted lock and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Dust, damp wood, and something else. Something old. The inside was just as simple as I remembered. A single room with a wood stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs. The shelves were still stocked with a few canned goods, probably expired years ago. I dropped my bag on the bed, took a breath, and told myself I'd spend one night. Just enough to make sure everything was in order before I listed it for sale. That was the plan. But plans don't always work out. I woke up cold. The fire I'd built in the wood stove had burned down to embers, and the room was dark. I shifted in the bed, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to get comfortable. That's when I heard it. A sound outside. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the frost-covered leaves just beyond the porch. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. The steps stopped. The cabin was old, the walls thin, but the silence was thick. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I let out a slow breath and reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on. The weak beam flickered across the wooden walls, the old table, the closed door. Everything was normal, just my imagination. I turned over, forcing my eyes shut. Sleep didn't come easy. Morning brought a heavy fog. I I stepped outside, rubbing the stiffness from my arms. The air was sharp and wet, the trees looming like shadows in the mist. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled the cabin, stopping just short of the porch. Bare feet. I swallowed hard, my breath clouding in the cold air. Someone had been out here last night. Watching. I scanned the woods, heart pounding. The fog made everything look endless, unfamiliar. I thought about leaving, but it was morning now. Things always made more sense in the daylight. I forced myself to shake it off. Just some drifter, maybe some hunter who got lost. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and tried not to think about it. The day passed in a blur of cleaning and organizing. I checked the roof, the foundation, took stock of the old supplies. The sooner I could get everything in order, the sooner I could leave. By sunset, I was exhausted. I made a quick meal, lit a lantern, and sat at the table, staring at the wooden walls. The cabin felt smaller now. I told myself I'd sleep early, get out first thing in the morning. I barely finished my meal before I heard it again. A sound outside, a single creak of wood. The porch. I froze, my pulse hammering. The lantern's glow flickered against the walls. Slowly, I reached for my rifle. The cabin was silent. The air inside felt tight, heavy. Then the door. I remember the cold first. Not the kind that bites, but the kind that lingers. The kind that settles into your bones, slow and deep, until it feels like you were always meant to be cold. The plan was simple. 5 days alone in a cabin I found online. A remote place in northern Michigan, well off the beaten path. No electricity, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the quiet. I told myself I needed the time away. Too much noise back home. Work stress, people stress. The idea of total isolation didn't scare me. It sounded peaceful. The listing had been straightforward: one-room cabin, wood stove for heat, well water, and outhouse out back. The photos made it look sturdy enough, though old. The owner, some guy named Don, gave me a set of directions over email. It wasn't easy to find. After a 5-hour drive north, I turned onto a dirt road that barely looked like a road at all. I followed it for miles, the trees pressing in, the ruts in the path jarring my truck's suspension. Eventually, I came to a clearing. The cabin sat alone in the center. It was smaller than I expected. One window, a sagging porch, a chimney leaning just slightly to the side. A pile of firewood stacked near the door. The roof looked solid, though the walls were weathered and darkened from years of exposure. I turned off the truck. The engine cut out, and the silence rushed in like a flood. No cars.
No voices.
No wind. Just stillness. I got out, stretched, and took it in. Felt wrong. Not in any obvious way. Nothing was out of place. The cabin looked exactly as it had in the photos. The clearing was empty, surrounded by a dense wall of trees. But something in my gut twisted. Maybe it was just the quiet. Maybe I wasn't used to it yet. I shook the feeling off, grabbed my gear, and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my boots. The key was under a loose rock near the door, just like Don had said. I unlocked the door and went inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The space was simple: one room, a cot in the corner, a table and chair, a wood stove, empty shelves.
No decorations. No personal touches.
Just bare walls and the weight of years. I set my gear down and checked around. Everything seemed in order. The well pump outside worked. The firewood was dry. The outhouse was exactly what you'd expect. Cold, dark, and something I'd avoid using unless absolutely necessary. The first night passed without incident. I ate a can of soup, read by lantern light, then settled into my sleeping bag on the cot. I woke once in the night, unsure why. The fire had burned low. The room was dark. My breath hung in the air, the temperature having dropped. I listened. Nothing. No wind. No animals. No creaking of trees. Just silence. I rolled over and forced myself back to sleep. The second day I hiked. The forest was thick, the trees packed close together. I followed what looked like an old game trail, weaving deeper into the woods. The air was crisp, the ground frozen beneath a thin layer of frost. I expected to see wildlife. Squirrels, deer, birds, something. I saw nothing. No tracks in the frost. No movement in the branches. Just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. It was strange, but I kept going, figuring it was just the time of year. The further I went, the heavier the quiet became. Then I found something. A cabin. Not mine. Smaller, older, almost hidden between the trees. I hadn't seen it on the way out. The door hung open slightly, the wood blackened with rot. I stood there for a long time, staring. Something felt wrong about it. The way it sat, sunken into the earth. The way the doorway gaped, dark and hollow. I should have walked away. Instead, I stepped closer. The inside was worse. Empty.
No furniture.
No signs of life. Just a single, small room with a dirt floor. The walls were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged, layered, as if something had scraped them over and over again. I turned and left, made my way back to my own cabin without looking back. That night, something changed. I built the fire higher, the flames snapping and twisting. The shadows stretched long across the cabin walls. The quiet had weight now. I felt it pressing in, thick and heavy, like the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, but something alive. At some point, I dozed off. I woke to a sound, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not inside, outside. Slow, careful steps moving through the frost-covered clearing. I held my breath, listened. The steps circled the cabin. Once, twice, then they stopped. Right outside the window. I didn't move. The fire flickered. The room was too quiet. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe, to blink. The air felt thick, my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then the footsteps started again, moving away this time, back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. Morning. I stepped outside, rifle in hand. The frost had been disturbed. Footprints, bare feet. They led from the woods, circled the cabin, then stopped directly beneath the window. But there was something else. A single, small handprint pressed against the glass. I left that day, packed my gear, hiked back to my truck, and drove without stopping. I never went back. I never checked the listing again. But sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, I think about the cabin, about the footprints, and I wonder if I left soon enough. I didn't think much about the listing when I first saw it. A small off-grid cabin, deep in the Montana wilderness. Perfect for solitude, the ad said. Remote, peaceful. The photos showed a modest wooden structure, nothing fancy, but sturdy enough. It was exactly what I needed. Life back home had become unbearable. Work, responsibilities, constant stress. I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I needed to step away, clear my head. I booked it for 2 weeks. The owner, a man named James, sent me a message with the details. No road access, no cell service, no electricity. Wood stove for heat, a well for water, a small generator if I needed it. I didn't mind. I wanted the quiet. If I had known what waited for me out there, I never would have gone. Day 1, the drive took all day. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was already dipping low. I stopped at a small general store for supplies. Canned food, extra batteries, propane for the camp stove. The woman at the counter asked where I was headed. I told her. She paused. "Be careful out there," she said. Weather turns quick this time of year. I nodded, paid, and left. The last stretch of road was rough, barely more than a dirt trail winding through endless pine forest. My truck bounced over rocks and ruts, dust kicking up behind me. After an hour, I reached the end of the trail. I parked, grabbed my gear, and started walking. It was a 2-mile hike to the cabin, following an old footpath. The trees loomed tall on either side, the forest thick and unbroken. I walked fast, my boots crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. The cabin appeared suddenly, a small clearing in the trees. It was exactly like the photos. A one-room structure, a small porch, a pile of split firewood stacked neatly against the side. I stepped onto the porch, found the key under a loose board, and unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. A cot in the corner, a wood stove, a small table and chair.
No dequeraschens, no personal touches.
Just bare walls and silence. I set my gear down, started a fire in the stove, and unpacked. By the time I ate, it was full dark. The forest outside was completely silent. No wind.
No rustling branches.
No distant sounds of animals. Just nothing. I told myself it was normal, but I locked the door anyway. Day 2, I woke to pale morning light filtering through the trees. I stepped outside, stretched, and took in the forest. The air was crisp, the ground damp with morning dew. I decided to explore. I followed a small game trail leading away from the cabin. The trees were packed tight, branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The deeper I went, the heavier the silence became.
No birds. No squirrels. No insects.
Just the quiet. I hiked for an hour, keeping track of my steps, making sure I could find my way back. That's when I saw it. A small wooden structure, half hidden in the trees. Not a cabin, a shack. The walls were warped with age, the roof sagging inward. I stepped closer, boots sinking into the soft earth. The door was missing. Inside, the space was empty.
No furniture. No belongings.
Just 4 walls, dark with rot. But there were scratches, dozens of them, long, jagged marks carved into the wood, running from floor to ceiling. I didn't stay long. By the time I got back to my cabin, the sun was dipping low. I started a fire, ate a can of soup, and tried to push the shack from my mind. That night, I woke to a sound. Soft, distant, a slow, deliberate crack of a branch. I sat up, heart hammering. Listened. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, but I lay awake until dawn. Day 3, I found the footprints that morning. Not mine. They circled the cabin, moving slow and deliberate. Bare feet. The prints led from the tree line, stopped by the window, then trailed back into the forest. My stomach twisted. I scanned the trees, rifle in hand. Nothing. No movement. No sound. But I wasn't alone out here. I spent the rest of the day inside. I kept the fire high, kept my rifle close. Every so often, I checked the window. The forest didn't move. The sun set. The cabin filled with shadows. I told myself it was fine. Then, just past midnight, the footsteps started again. Slow, careful, circling. I gripped the rifle tight, heart pounding. The fire crackled, throwing flickering light across the walls. Then silence. The steps had stopped. Right outside the window. I held my breath. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, the fire burned low. I didn't sleep. Day for morning came slow. I stepped outside, breath clouding in the cold air. The footprints were back. Closer this time. A single handprint pressed against the glass. I needed to leave. I packed fast, shoving my gear into my bag. The hike back to my truck should have taken an hour. Took longer. The trees felt different. The path twisted in ways it hadn't before. Then I saw him, a figure, standing deep in the trees. Still, watching, barefoot. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my truck, heart hammering, tossed my bag inside, started the engine. The road back felt longer. The forest stretched endless on either side. The figure never followed, but I could still feel him, watching. By the time I reached the highway, the sky was dark. The cabin was miles behind me. I didn't stop driving, didn't tell anyone. But sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, I think about the footprints, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting. I never had a reason to be scared of the woods. I grew up around them. As a kid, I spent summers running through thick tree lines, climbing rocks, fishing in still lakes with my father. It always felt like home to me. The silence, the isolation, it was comforting. When I got older, I found myself craving that kind of peace again, so I started taking solo trips. Just me, a truck full of supplies, and a week or two away from the rest of the world. This time, I went deeper than usual. I rented an old hunting cabin miles away from any main roads. It wasn't one of those cozy, polished cabins they list for tourists. It was just a one-room shack with a tin roof, a wood stove, and a cot. No running water, no electricity, no cell service. The guy who owned it told me that hunters used it in the fall, but no one had been out there since last season. That was fine by me. I wanted the space to myself. I got there in the late afternoon. The road leading up to the cabin was more of a dirt path than an actual road, full of ruts and fallen branches. My truck barely made it. The cabin itself was set in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines and brush. It looked even rougher than I expected. The wood was aged and cracked in places. The door hung a little crooked, and the small window on the side was fogged with grime. But it was sturdy. It would do. I spent the first couple of hours settling in. I swept out dust and dead leaves that had blown in through gaps in the walls. I stacked the firewood someone had left behind, checked for leaks in the roof, set up my small camping stove in the corner. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat if you stand still long enough. That was part of the reason I liked these trips. No traffic, no people talking, no hum of electricity, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. That first night was uneventful. I ate a simple meal, read by lantern light, and turned in early. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside, but it was probably just an animal. I'd seen deer tracks near the clearing. Maybe a raccoon rummaging through the underbrush. I wasn't worried. The next morning, I took a hike. I followed an old game trail that led further into the woods. It was overgrown, but I could still make out where the path had been worn down by animals and hunters over the years. I walked for hours, taking my time, stopping now and then to take in the view or listen to the sounds of the forest. I didn't see another person the entire time. I liked it that way. I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon. That's when I noticed something strange. The door was open, just a crack. I was sure I had shut it when I left. I always double-check. At first, I thought maybe I just hadn't latched it all the way, and the wind had pushed it open. But when I stepped inside, I knew that wasn't it. My sleeping bag was unrolled. I had left it rolled up at the foot of the cot, but now it was spread out like someone had been lying in it. My backpack was open, too, even though I clearly remembered zipping it shut. Nothing was missing, as far as I could tell, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I checked the cabin thoroughly. There was nowhere for someone to hide. Just the one room, for bare walls, and a couple of shelves. The windows were too grimy to see through properly, so if someone had been watching me, they would have had to do it from the woods. I stood at the door for a long time, staring out into the trees, listening. I didn't hear anything. Still, I felt exposed. I locked the door, even though the latch was weak, and wedged a chair under the handle just in case. That night, I kept my lantern burning longer than usual. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds outside, the wind in the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. And then, much later, something else. A rustling sound. Not the wind, not an animal. Slow, deliberate movements just beyond the clearing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened. The sound stopped. The forest was silent again. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer passing through. Maybe the wind shifting branches in a way that sounded like footsteps. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, narrower, barefoot. They led from the edge of the clearing to the door, then away again. I followed them a short distance before they disappeared into the brush. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees. There was no one in sight. I told myself it had to be a hiker, maybe some drifter passing through. But who hikes out this far barefoot? And why come up to my cabin, open my door, go through my things, and then leave without taking anything? I wanted to leave, pack up, drive out, forget the whole thing. But I had planned this trip for months. And besides, I had spent nights alone in the woods before. I knew how easy it was to let fear get the best of you. So I stayed. That night, I heard the sound again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate shuffling just outside the cabin. I lay there, perfectly still, my heart hammering. It moved around the side of the cabin. I heard it pause near the window. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Then silence. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I went outside. More footprints. This time, they circled the cabin. Whoever it was had been out there for a while. I had to go. I packed up as quickly as I could. I threw my gear into the truck and started the engine. As I backed up, something caught my eye. Near the edge of the clearing, where the tree line began, there was a shape, a figure, standing still, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. I didn't stop to get a better look. I put my foot down on the gas and didn't let up until I was miles away. I never went back.